more about that this evening, I'm very proud to say. Could I just have my first slide, because I can't resist making a few points. These are nice points, they're not, okay. There's Naomi, in case you... One more? Is it my slide somewhere? Yeah. Oh, there it is. So we're proud of Batik Nyonyas, and I want to congratulate the curators Peter Lee, Daryl, and Naomi for their fantastic work on this exhibition. Two major events have happened. First of all, the Prof. Co. Award for Best-Selling Publication has gone to Batik Nyonyas due to their work and the wonderful design. And the New York Times, one of the few remaining sensible newspapers in the United States, recently published an article of 36 hours in Singapore. And unlike the sort of drop-in visits that are normally written in this fashion, this was actually written by a Singaporean. And here you see Naomi dancing on the top of a building. No, that's not true. Sorry. But they focused on the Peranakan Museum, the article did, as one of the great things to see in Singapore. And as you know, tourists love the Peranakan Museum because it is a unique and interesting view of culture that one can never really find anywhere else in Southeast Asia or in the world. And it's always been our aim as curators and directors to push the Peranakan Museum and grow it to new levels and make it more resonant in a sense of as a reflection of Singapore's complex mixed heritage, but also that of Southeast Asia, especially island Southeast Asia generally. So we're continuing to think about that and push for that. But interestingly enough, one of the photographs in the New York Times is this, which is an excerpt from the Batik Nyonyas exhibition. And here you see the work of the three makers, mainly Wee Kok Sing, I think, Jane Hendromartono's mother. So I think we should be very proud of this international attention. I've already got little messages from all over the world saying, wow, Peranakan Museum, and you know, what's that exhibition of all these nice textiles? Well, they're batiks that we're going to hear about tonight. So I just need to thank the Dalio Philanthropies group, which has supported this series of monthly talks, monthly conversations around topics having to do with the Asian Civilisations Museum and the Peranakan Museum. So thank you to them. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Naomi Wang, who's been with ACM nearly 10 years. She started as I was finishing my term here. We worked on the Port Cities exhibition together and brainstormed a lot of those ideas. And it's wonderful to see her flourish and grow. And it's also been a great pleasure for me to work with her closely again around Batik Nyonyas on the catalog and the exhibition. So my pleasure. Naomi?
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for the wonderful introduction, and good evening to all. I'd like to foreground today's talk with a round of thank yous, for this project would not have been possible without the incredible support and expertise of the following people. To my co-curators of this exhibition, Peter Lee and Daryl Lim, thank you for the tremendous effort in driving this project to fruition. This exhibition really represents the singular vision, passion, and determination of Peter Lee, who in 2011 first introduced the museum to descendants of this family of batik makers from Pekalongan. Thank you, Peter, for relentlessly pushing this project through and sharing your knowledge and collections so generously. From 2011, it took the museum another 6 years to negotiate a gift of 100 batiks from the descendants of the Wee family and another team of curators to accession this gift. To this end, I would like to express my thanks to Jackie, Maria, and Dominic for accessioning this gift and laying the groundwork for our research. To the Hendromartono sisters who have given us the honor and privilege of working on this project regarding the legacy of your mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, thank you for opening your family's archives and sharing about your family's batik making history, and also ensuring that every possible resource was made available to us in the course of our research. This project would not have been possible without your support and involvement. My thanks as well, of course, to Alan, former director of the ACM and Peranakan Museum, for championing this gift during your time here, and your vision as the editor of our book, along with Ben and Sharon from our editorial teams. Last, thank you to our director, Clement, for his unwavering support, and of course to Melissa, Priscilla, and Denise for organizing today's talk. It truly takes a village. Today's talk will follow a four-part structure. I will first provide an overview of the Wee family of batik makers from Pekalongan, followed by a very brief explanation of the 150 Wee family batiks in the National Collection, essentially the data set which allowed us to chart the chronological arc of Jane Hendromartono's career. As divided into 5 eras from the early 1940s all the way to the 1980s. Last, I will conclude with some final thoughts to summarize Jane's almost 50-year career as a batik maker. Jane Hendromartono came from a family of batik makers in Pekalongan. She inherited the business and workshop from her mother, Nyonya Wee Kok Seng, and her mother inherited the same from her mother-in-law, Nyonya Wee Sun King. Jane was the youngest of her mother's 6 children, and only 2 known photographs show 3 generations of women together. In this photograph, Jane stands behind her grandmother, Nyonya Wee Sun King, who is seated in the middle. On her right sits Jane's mother, Nyonya Wee Kok Seng, and on the other end, her father, Wee Kok Seng. Jane was very aware of her special position as a 3rd-generational batik making practitioner. Her numerous work, correspondences, and personal belongings attest to this. In a photo album compiled by Jane from the 1950s, the first page situates her life and identity in relation to her mother and grandmother, illustrating the immense influence her forebears had on her art and career. During her lifetime, Jane proudly promoted the works of her forebears alongside her own. In 1984, all 3 women's works were exhibited in the landmark exhibition Fabled Cloth Batik from Java's North Coast, which traveled to several museums across North America. This image here shows Jane at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, standing alongside her grandmother, mother, and her own work. The exhibition also culminated in a publication which captured for the first time Jane's multi-generational batik-making heritage. In a letter written to the author of the 1984 publication, Inger McCabe Elliott, Jane corrects the author's erroneous labeling of her mother and grandmother's names. She clarifies the necessity to include Mrs. or the Indonesian honorific equivalent Nyonya in order to correctly identify her forebears. All 3 women lived and worked in the same 2-story terraced house at 48 Pintu Dalam, now referred to as 36 Jalan Blimbing, located in the Chinese quarter of Pekalongan. 2 wells in the house provided a continuous supply of water, much needed for making batik. On your left, you see a work made by Jane after her marriage to her husband Lim Seok Hin in 1947. She signs on the bottom, "From Mr. and Mrs. Lim Seok Hin, Pintu Dalam 48 Pekalongan." This is the only batik we have from Jane referencing the old address, which confirms that Jane continued to work out of her mother's workshop at the family home even after her marriage. Jane started her career as her mother's apprentice, and both mother and daughter would go on to collaborate and create batiks together. On the right, a hanging made by Jane's mother advertises her batik atelier in Pekalongan. The central figure in both works is most likely Mei Lanfang, a Chinese Peking opera artist who was a pioneer in introducing Peking opera internationally from the 1910s to the 1950s. The actor excelled in performing female roles as women were not allowed to perform in opera then. The scene depicts the heroine in the midst of a sleeve dance. By the 1940s, Mei Lan Fang must have been a popular enough icon on Java for both women to incorporate this pop cultural reference in their work. Jane began her education attending Dutch schools in Pekalongan and Semarang, where her love of art was already evident. At home, she spoke Dutch, Javanese, Indonesian, English, and Mandarin, and participated in a cultural milieu that mingled the Chinese, Javanese, and Dutch colonial elements necessary for the family's businesses in batik, bird's nest, and herbal medicine. Like her mother, Jane not only continued the batik business, but persisted in cultivating bird's nests at home and sold herbal medicine to supplement the family income. Many documents belonging to Jane contain recipes for various herbal medicinal concoctions. The Peranakan Museum is grateful for the many gifts from the Hendromartono family, the family of Mr. and Mrs. Lee Kip Lee and Mr. Agam Riyadi. For these gifts and 2 separate batik acquisitions have provided us the golden opportunity of deep diving into careers worth of works that have allowed us to chart the dynamic arc of each batik maker's career against the backdrop of their lives. Of the 150 batiks made by the Wee family of Pekalongan, 69 are attributed to Jane Hendromartono. 5 were made at the very beginning of her career in the early 1940s. 31 were made sometime around her marriage from 1948 to the 50s, and the remaining bulk of 33 works were executed from 1967 to the end of her career in the 80s. These were exciting works to study as they reflected changes in the era of a new Republic of Indonesia. From the 69 batiks made by Jane, 5 different signatures were observed to have been used by the maker, forming the basis of today's presentation. The earliest works made by Jane date to the early 1940s and exemplify the period when she became her mother's apprentice. The 2 batiks you see here came from 2 separate gifts, from Jane's daughters on the left and the family of Mr. and Mrs. Lee Kip Lee on the right. The sarong on the right bears the stamp Wee Kok Sing, dated 9th September 1941. Although the cloth shows numerous elements in Jane's style, especially the delightful small animals such as angelfishes, giraffes, rabbits, elephants, and turtles. The work was made in collaboration with her mother when Jane was 16 years old. Jane's first complete batiks were created under her mother's name, Nyonya Wee Kok Sing, although they are already vastly different from her mother's style. Jane also did not retain her mother's habit of dating her works. In 1947, Jane married Lim Seok Hin. Their wedding invitation at the behest of Jane's mother, Nyonya Wee Kok Sing, took place in Solo, where the family moved to live temporarily at her mother's ancestral home due to the Japanese occupation of the Dutch Indies. This is the second known photograph showing all 3 generations of batik makers together. All the women are seated in the front row. This photograph was taken at a Chinese association in Solo. The Chinese Republican flag is seen flanking a portrait of Sun Yat-sen above. After their marriage in 1947, Jane and her husband Lim Seok Hin embarked on their own enterprise under his name, although they continued to work out of her mother's workshop. Only 2 works from the collection bear the rare signatures of both makers. The example here is signed by both mother and daughter, showing that even though Jane and her husband embarked on their own enterprise under his name, she continued to make collaborative works with her mother. At the beginning of Jane's career, her clients were her mothers, which although much reduced and aging, still demanded fine quality sarongs and kayins. During this time, she concentrated on producing batiks in the luxuriant style popular at the time. In the 1930s, a special type of batik had been created by a small group of Peranakan Chinese makers in Kudus. a small coastal town 150 kilometers east of Pekalongan. The characteristic features of Batik Kudusan are a brown background and meticulously rendered designs, including complicated background patterns. Nyonya Lee Boon In, whose work you see here, was one such maker from Kudus. Such works earned Kudus a reputation for producing superb batiks unmatched by other centers on Java. By the 1950s, this style had gone viral and began to capture the imagination of batik makers beyond Kudus. Not only was the brown palette and intricate patterns emulated, but batik makers like Jane even signed their batiks with Kudus, although they lived and worked only in Pekalongan. The Kudus inscriptions have understandably caused confusion. The label was not used to identify her location, nor to cater to customers in Kudus, as some scholars have suggested. Instead, it indicated that the batik was made in the prestigious Kudus style. This early example from Jane's Batik Kudusan series dates from the period when Jane was taking over her mother's business. Even in these early works, Jane avoided copying her mother's style. You see here roses, irises, and sunflower bouquets, and they illustrate how Jane sought to create a distinctive look by adding unusual clusters and combinations of blooming flowers. This artistic character persists in a batik made for her mother's 60th birthday in 1955, as she writes to her friend Mrs. Bloom. Jane describes including bouquets of different flowers combined in clusters. By this time, Jane had successfully created fine batik in the technically difficult Kudus style, a feat in itself for a young batik maker. In the same way that Jane asserted her own individuality by creating distinctive combinations of floral bouquets, she continued to express herself artistically. Using the foundation of Batik Kudusan, she imbued her designs with expressive, playful, and contemporary elements. In this example, she includes the angelfish, starfish, seashells, and various aquatic plants in a fantastical underwater display. These whimsical and delightful animals would become a trademark of Jane's, something that she had already introduced in her early work, as you see on your far right, from 1941 when she was 16 years old. Jane continued to experiment in the 1950s. In a sarong sign, Lim Seok Hin, Pekalongan, she abandoned background designs and filler patterns, except in the kapala and borders. The undecorated background highlights the delightful design of birds carrying envelopes and flowers in their beaks as they dart between chrysanthemum and cattleya orchids. The absence of background filler pattern marks a distinct departure from the Kudus style, which probably led to the artist labeling this piece Pekalongan instead of Kudus. A rare composite Kudus-style sarong further illustrates Jane's evolving process. Only the kapala is brown, while the rest of the cloth has an undyed ground, highlighting the tiny blue and purple chandi motifs. The undyed ground does not indicate that the piece is incomplete. On the contrary, it was more difficult to control the batik process to achieve an unblemished white ground. From Batik Kudusan, Jane retained its detailed filler motifs and complex background designs, but began to experiment with discarding its brown background. And finally, this Kayin Panjang sign, Lim Seok Hin, Pekalongan, Java 58, shows how Jane has come full circle as she no longer labels her works Kudus. With an undyed ground filled with multicolored triangles and paisley-shaped motifs, an imaginary world emerges composed of fish, rocks, birds, and flowers. This striking combination of densely filled patterns from Batik Kudusan, but with an undyed ground, together with unusual combinations of floral and fauna, represents a new style, one that can no longer be called Kudus. She thus reclaims her native Pekalongan as the site of her art. In the 1950s, the batik industry was swept along by tides of change in the formation of the new Indonesian Republic. With Indonesia's independence, President Sukarno articulated a new Indonesian identity based on clothing and dress. A new national style was born called Batik Indonesia, or Jawa Baru, meaning New Java, which combined colors and patterns from the North Coast, the Principalities, and West Java. Jane similarly produced works in this new style, mirroring political changes in the country. In 1959, President Sukarno articulated guiding principles under the acronym, which led Jane to inscribe one cloth, as you see here, with the word Uzbek. The two leaf-like patterns in the upper right suggest that the batik was designed as a dress fabric, probably to be used on a collar or sleeves of a dress. The work demonstrates that the kain panjang could be reformatted as a modern cloth for garments. The Garuda, as well as the related lar and sawat wing motifs, gained new prominence in batik after this creature became Indonesia's national emblem in the 1950s. At the same time, Jane-like makers Hadronogoro or Gotik Swan experimented with expanding the scale of batik motifs. This work shows greatly enlarged peacock plumage, the upswept wings resembling a stylized Garuda. This emblem reveals how Jane was inspired to create new designs in the new national style. Jane's deep involvement with the government's push to create a modern Indonesian identity inspired her to create boldly designed batiks in dialogue with other batik makers. Producing batik in the era of the New Republic presented complex challenges and encouraged new types of collaboration. Although Jane had strong support from the government, she grappled with an increasingly fraught social and political landscape. Chinese Indonesians were frequently targeted as sympathizers of the Indonesian Communist Party. Attempts to purge communists led to mass killings in 1965 and 1966. In 1966, Chinese Indonesians were required to adopt Indonesian names. And as you see here in 1967, Jane's family changed their surname to Hendromartono. And so we, Jinyo, became Arijati Hendromartono. Amid increasing pressure to prove her Indonesian identity, Jane considered rebranding as Ramayana Batik Art in reference to the beloved Indian epic well known throughout Indonesia. At one point, she combined her husband's old name with the new Indonesian one as L.S. Hendromartono, although the effort to retain the Chinese name was soon abandoned. Hendromartono's Batik Art Unique was eventually chosen and became her new international brand. During this time, Jane's business had to change. The multi-generational batik workshop located in her home closed. As a result, she formed exclusive collaborations with 4 batik workshop operators in Pekalongan. The photograph on your right shows Jane's daughter, Inga, photographed alongside Abu Bakar Noor and his son. The photograph below is of Mr. Bakar's batik workshop in Pekalongan. These partnerships were very important as they allowed Jane to increase her output. It was also during this period that Jane developed batik stamps for her brand, as it was no longer practical to sign each piece by hand. Jane's partnership with Hamid Yassin was the most enduring. Her family depended on Hamid Yassin to navigate difficult social changes. For example, the family's new Indonesian name was suggested by Hamid Yassin. In a photograph taken at Lim Seok Hin's funeral in 1973, you see Hamid Yassin standing directly behind Jane and her daughters as testament to their family's close relationship. Hamid Yassin and Jane collaborated closely on the design and color of her batiks. On the left is a sarong made by Hamid Yassin for his son's wedding. Superimposed throughout are Jane's phoenixes, a prominent feature in her works as seen in a hanging she made in 1972 on your right. During the racial riots in Pekalongan in 1966, Hamid Yassin stood in front of Jane's home to protect her family, preventing her home from being badly damaged or looted. After the riots, Jane temporarily kept her batiks and valuables for safekeeping in this very same room you see on this slide in Hamid Yassin's home. The batiks gifted from the Hendromartono family to the museum was made possible in large part because they were kept here for safekeeping during the difficult years of 1966. One of the most radical developments in batik during the early Republic was its use for tailored clothing. For centuries, batik had been applied almost exclusively as skirt cloths and rarely as material to be cut and sewn into garments. In 1972, Ali Siddiqui, the then governor of Jakarta, introduced the long-sleeved batik shirt as formal attire for men, inspired by the Barong Tagalog of the Philippines. During this time, batik was promoted both domestically and internationally. Jane was invited to present her work to Queen Juliana of the Netherlands during her state visit of 1971. She created, amongst many pieces, a batik in the Wonogirin style, popular in the 1960s and 1970s, with a soga palette, crackled, undyed background, and alas-alasan or forest pattern of the central Javanese courts. Jane gave an original spin to the pattern by adding elephants in recognition of Prince Bernhard's role in establishing the World Wildlife Fund in 1961. The work was widely publicized, bringing further attention and spotlight on Jane as a batik maker. In the Compass article dated 20th of June 1972, it prominently features the artwork and identifies the maker as Nyonya J. Hendromartono. While President Sukarno pioneered batik Indonesia, but President Suharto expanded the impact of batik in international fashion with the designer Iwan Tirta. Although Iwan was not the first Indonesian designer to employ batik, he pioneered the use of fashion and photography to enhance its media presence. Like Iwan, Jane's expressive designs during this period coincided with the rise of fashion photography, runway shows, and textile fairs, which with the help of state sponsorship altered the design lexicon of batik. This led to bigger and bolder designs that photographed well and were well suited to print advertising. Jane executed large designs that emphasized the kinetic qualities of animals. In a fabric proposed for Iwan Tirta, she draws two large phoenixes rising up each side of a dress. This clearly shows that even when working on commission, Jane took part in the design conceptualization of her batiks. Jane worked closely with Indonesia's top fashion designers from the onset of their careers in the early 1970s. In 1973, for example, she produced batiks for Iwan's fashion shows in Europe and received orders from Adianto, Prayudi, and many others. It was not until our discovery of Jane's records that these collaborations have come to light. The important role of Pekalongan batik makers in creating batiks for fashion designers has not received sufficient attention, highlighting a gap in the narrative of fashion scholarship today. Ali Siddiqui's radical promotion of batik for tailored clothing created a whole new facet for the batik industry, which led to many more opportunities for Jane. Ready-to-wear and off-the-rack garments in the 70s and 80s used real batiks and printed imitations for fashionable clothing around the world. Jane produced a wide variety of batik for export, from fine hand-drawn luxury pieces to mass-produced stamped cloth. This photograph is taken in a retail store named Tropics, opened by Gordon Bishop in Soho, New York, in the 70s. In the 70s as well, Inger McCabe Elliott, founder of the textile and design company China Seas, was a regular customer, buying both old and new works from Jane. In the 1970s, Elliott used Jane's white ground batiks on garments by designer Perry Ellis, which retailed at Bloomingdale's in the United States. Jane received neither credit nor royalties from this venture. As a result, she added the copyright symbol to her cloths. Copying has had a long tradition in the batik industry, but greatly intensified with machine printing. In order to cater to the demands of the export market, Jane focused on mass production by producing competitively priced block-printed batiks, but she drew the line at venturing into machine prints as it did not honor the process of batik making. By the 1980s, Jane developed a strong export business in collaboration with retailers and manufacturers globally, from the Caribbean to all the way down to Australia, creating a full range of batik textiles from ready-to-wear garments to furnishing fabrics. It was during this time that she often signed not only under Jane Hendromartono or Jane Hendro, but with her given name in Chinese Ren or Jin in Hokkien, the name used by her family and childhood friends. Was this a reassertion of her personal identity at a time when her art, business, and brand were already famous? Jane's versatility and dynamism is represented by the 5 names she used on her work. She evolved from signing batiks with her mother's name, Nyonya Wee-Kok Sing, to using her husband's name, Lim Seok Hin, and then the brand name Hendromartono's Batik Art Unique. Finally, from the 1970s, she signed her work under her new name, Jane Hendromartono, and also with her given name in Chinese Ren, or as I mentioned, Jin in Hokkien. Jane's creative engagement with her times provides a complex and authentic image of a modern woman creating work for many different markets in the second half of the 20th century. Thank you.
Naomi, that was so interesting. Thank you very much. It's a tough one. Oh, don't show off photos. Go back one slide. This is a fabulous photograph of Jane. What strikes me is that, you know, the 5 names, the 5 styles, maybe even more than 5 styles. There were, you know, many, many more. And we didn't even talk about the revival styles where she actually copies her mother's or grandmother's work to respond to foreign collectors who wanted something very traditional. So, you know, this can be multiplied. 5 names reminds me of the 3 Faces of Eve, the movie from the 50s of a schizophrenic, emotionally troubled woman. Is there an element of instability here for Jane's work? Was she not sure of what she wanted? Did she have to change her style so often to meet the market, to raise funds? I mean, do you sense any sense of unease, of instability in her work? What do you think?
I think in looking at the shape and form of all of Jane's body of work, I think it's undeniable that there was a lot of experimentation in terms of the need to respond to different changes socially and politically in her life. But I think what stood out for me for Jane was she had this sense of intuition in terms of knowing how her work would be received by different markets. So I didn't mention this before, but in 1984, when her work was exhibited alongside her mother and grandmother's works and had a touring exhibition in North America, the curator then had written to her and asked, could you please propose a work that you would think that you think is most representative of your practice? She had proposed a work that she had made in the 1950s, a batik kudusan piece, which
in itself was a very curious choice, because by the 1980s she had already established many successful lines that was commercially successful, but that she had gone back to the 1950s, 30 years before, to choose an older work that had featured kind of chinoiserie style of a Chinese gardens with the rock formations and Chinese lanterns showing the double happiness, Chinese character. And it almost felt like she understood that her work could be consumed by a Western audience in a certain way. I don't think that she was naive enough to present a work that was so Chinese to an audience that was so Westernized, but she understood that perhaps there could be a certain lens in which her work could be read. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, throughout the decades, she responded to what the market wanted. There definitely was a level of experimentation, but she was very clear about how her work was to be received, and how she would also position her works to be received in a certain way.
The early Indonesian stuff, where there's a response to the nationalism and these dark batiks with green and blue and big patterns, whether they're phoenixes or bat wings, or the Uzbek piece, they seem very strange to our modern taste. You know, they don't look like batik. They look like very much period pieces from the 50s or 60s, kind of these. I personally don't like them because they're so dark and strange, and I think, well, what's that about? Do you think she was responding to this new nationalism in a very strong way? Because many of her peers were doing the same thing. There was this sort of universal style of dark colors that could be used in a certain way. How much collaboration was it? Did she exchange ideas with the other batik makers of her time?
I mean, from the 50s, we don't have any kind of documentation that she had collaborated with other batik makers, but certainly no work is created in silo. And she would have been very aware of what her peers and other fellow batik makers were making. In the 50s, the style and fashion of batik was such that soga brown, the greens that you're not a big fan of, were really in vogue. That was the style of the time. And we know so much about Gothic Swan, who was later renamed Hadronogoro, whose works represented this era in terms of this type of color palette. But his mentor was really the national composer Ibu Sud. And she looked back at her own cultural background. She was from West Java, and she really was credited for teasing out not just the colors from Pekalongan, but also these red and green color palettes, and introduced them into the design vocabulary and chromatic kind of like exploration of batik Indonesia. And so this was a new kind of this was a new era where a new modern palette was created for Indonesia. And Jane must have known of the works made by Ibu Sud, as well Gothic Swan. And so she was merely, I think, also in a way responding and in dialogue with other makers of her era. And it really demonstrates very clearly that she was really very eager to be part of this group of nationally sanctioned group of batik makers who had a lot to stand and to gain from the government support.
I mean, the family had connections with Solo, and we don't talk about what that connection might be. Was her grandmother was from Solo and moved there for part of the war, right? Was there any attempt to sort of draw something from the central court style? Do you sense any of this happening in Jane's career?
I think with the Batik Indonesia era, so from the late 50s and onwards, there was definitely this attempt to appropriate and also freely appropriate patterns and colors from courtly tradition, from central Javanese courts. So in the elephant batik that Jane made for Prince Bernard, for example, she was clearly very aware. She subscribed extensively to Dutch and Chinese literature. she was kept very up to date with political events and pop culture events in Holland, and she knew very well of Prince Bernhard's role as the founder of the World Wildlife Fund in the 60s. And clearly she made a batik in the classical colors of soga brown, white and soga brown, because it was befitting of his station and status as a person of royalty. And also by appropriating the Wonogirin and alas-alasan patterns that were used in court patterns, she clearly understood very well who her target audience was in that sense. So yes, I think she had a very clear sense and understanding of court patterns, not just from Solo, but from all over Java, in order to freely appropriate them for her own work.
And it's one of her most successful batiks from this later period, don't you think? I mean, there's no sense of chasing a specific market or giving up her soul in order to impress the prince, right? I mean, it is a very successful batik, I think, yeah. Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it's difficult to deal with an artist that changes so much. You know, you sort of wonder, is she selling out? Is she chasing the market, chasing the money? But I think you made a very convincing case for this innovation, yeah. Let's take some questions from the audience. Oh, there's some microphones there. Any questions or for Naomi? I'll have to call on people. Clement, I see you have your hand up. Did you have a... question at the back, sorry.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ignatius. I have a question about the relevance to Singapore audience, as we are aware that Kabaya has been made as a UNESCO heritage list, and it's shared between Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. And one component is batik. And how would you want to drive the identity of Singapore batik in this context? That's the first question. The second question is, how do you envision Singapore batik wearer to upgrade their batik? Because as far as I know for now, I'm concerned about the quality of the batiks that people are wearing over here. Apologies for that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, I'll try to answer the first one. I think that the lens here is really to look at batik as also a luxury commodity that was very much desired by not just Singaporeans, but by a global community. And Pekalongan, of course, was the center for making batiks, but I think the important thing to also grasp at is as well, but it was a center of batik making for both expensive and non-expensive batik. The spectrum was very wide. There is a market, there's a demand for batik at every level. So I guess, I don't know if I already answered your question, but I think from a Singapore point of view, batik was very much consumed, but also traded through retailers in Singapore. They continue to trade through our batik retailers. So actually one really nice story that we discovered with this show is one of Jane's most successful retailers, Tyler Wilson, who brought her works and distributed her works throughout retail shops in Virgin Islands, through the Caribbean, throughout the United States. She first discovered Jane's works while shopping on Arab Street at Basha Haril Brothers, which is still there today. And it was this coincidence or this chance moment of looking at Jane's works, and it had the label Hendromartono's Batik Art Unit Pekalongan, that sent Twyla on this little hunting journey to Pekalongan to look for Jane. And then they started a decade-long, very successful business collaboration throughout all the way to the 80s, all the way to Jane's death. So I guess the idea that, you know, batik, the consumption of batik, it's borderless. And these are trade goods that are consumed by people of different nationalities and ethnicities, and also at different price points and different levels. As you can see in Jane's works in the 70s and 80s, she created very fine luxury batiks that designers such as Iwan Tirta and Prayudi were using for bespoke gowns, but at the same time she also catered to kind of young American hippies who were doing mass production and off the rack and mass export to global markets around the world.
One of the great things I think about this art form is that it is so cross-cultural. I mean, the cotton itself is not native. It's machine-made cotton from England or occasionally from Japan. The dyes come from Germany. You know, as you say, it's consumed but worn in different ways. You know, so to look at even modern nation states as owning different pieces of this puzzle is very misleading. It's really owned by everybody, by the wearers, by the consumers, even by those hippie collectors, which I find so amusing. So that's one of the interesting things about the port cities which connect us through, is that it's really kind of transnational, cross-cultural. Yeah.
And something we sometimes don't really look at because we don't have enough documentation is the relationship between the maker and the patron, because that also drastically changes what art is being created.
Another question. There, two hands there. First, the guy in the middle.
Hi, my name is Kelvin. I have a question regarding how did you actually distill Jane's voice and also her perspectives other than letter correspondences between? Was there any video recordings of her? Because in the 80s, the camcorder would be up. I mean, just my concern would be, we just want to be as authentic as possible, and also were there like diaries or interviews she's done with the press in Indonesia or other parts of the world? Yeah, thank you.
So we don't have any video documentation from Jane's lifetime, but what we do have is a lot of material that's been kept by her family. So aside from her letters and documentation, there's also the possibility of cross-referencing with secondary materials such as newspapers, and also we have even her high school diary written entirely in Dutch, which gave tremendous insight into significant life events in the 40s, such as the wedding of her sisters, for example, which in a way helped us date a lot of and plot her life events. But in a way, it's really not possible to also say for sure that we have accurately captured the voice and spirit of Jane. What we can do is really to, as you have seen, in a kind of as extensively as possible, look at the body of what remains of her archives and try to make comparisons and try to compare her notes with what she has produced as an artist. So, for example, the discovery of the letter she wrote about a batik she made for her mother's 60th birthday in 1955 really draws home like her love for creating not just random flowers, but these flowers are clustered and have very unusual combinations. And if you look at her works, they really are very, very obvious that that's her sense of artistic articulation. But to have in her own voice something that she's also confirmed in writing, then it becomes very satisfying for us to make that kind of conclusion.
And up front here, yes.
Hi, thank you so much, Naomi, for your presentation. My name is Rani. I'm from Penang. I have two questions actually. Can you share some insights about how the Peranakan in Singapore obtained this, the batik Pekalongan? And then the second one is, how does Jane Hendromartono relates to the Uisuchun family? You know, the prominent batik maker from Kedongwuni. Maybe if you can share some insight, that would be great. Thank you so
For
much.
your first question, how
Does the Peranakan in Singapore obtain the batik from Pekalongan? Is it by trade or I don't know? Yeah, maybe you can share some thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general idea is that these batiks were made not just for Indonesian consumption. I mean, I think photographs very clearly show that all throughout the Strait settlements, women, and not just Peranakan women, were actively consuming batiks that were made from Pekalongan. There was, I think, this sense of real status that was attached to luxury cloths coming out of Pekalongan. So it really was part of this consumption, again, if I may emphasize, of luxury goods. It could be Pekalongan batiks, but it also could be tortoiseshell coming from India. And so that's the trade network operated in that way. And all the way till the 70s and the 80s, we can see even with Jane's correspondences that retailers such as the Aljunied family from Singapore would go to Pekalongan, to her workshops, to examine what type of batik she was making, to place orders in person. So that's, I think, how the retail network functioned. And your second question regarding the Uisuchun family, so they're completely unrelated. Kedongwuni is a suburb of Pekalongan, so the Uisuchun family is very, very famous as also a 3-generational practitioner, but they don't have family links, even though they are from the North Coast.
Another question. Back right there. Yeah. Next to Kyong.
Hello, my name is Nagina. I'm from England. I'm sitting next to Peter Lee. I know Peter from the 1980s, but we'll leave that there. I'm very fortunate that he took me earlier this afternoon to the Peranakan Museum. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. And I've seen all of the exhibits. It's an absolutely fantastic exhibition, and if you haven't been, I would strongly recommend it. My first, well, it's not really a question, it's an observation for Kelvin, actually. He was asking about the family, Jane's family, and the authenticity of the information and provenance of your documents. If you haven't seen the exhibition, I would recommend you go, because there's some lovely video footage where the daughters of Jane are interviewed, and there's nothing more authentic than your daughters or family telling you about what your mother is like. I know from experience. So that's the first observation. And then there is a question, and Naomi, thank you very much for your talk. It was absolutely wonderful and illuminating. When I watched the video in the exhibition, there was a section relating to the collaborations that Jane had with the indigenous Indonesian people that were there to help during the Troubles. And I just wondered what your views were about the collaborations and how effective that was. I mean, I have a view from watching the videos, but what's your view about how effective that was, and what would have happened if that collaboration hadn't taken place?
So we know even less about Jane's collaborations with the 4 different workshops. But what we do know, and we thank Jane for, is that she was very meticulous in record keeping. So we have a sense of how she distributed work across the 4 workshops. For the workshop of Mr. and Mrs. Bakar, for example, they often got her revival pieces that she made in the 70s and the 80s for a more Western clientele who were very eager to collect old or antique batiks and were familiar with older batiks. But also in interviewing Jane's daughters, who by the 70s and 80s would have a good sense of how their mother operated their workshops, we understand that Jane distributed different types of batiks to different workshops according to the abilities of their workers. But of the 4, she truly only had a kind of quite a deep and sustained and enduring artistic collaboration with Hamid Yassin, who is highlighted in the exhibition. And this is very evident because when Hamid Yassin passed away in 1981, the collaboration very quickly fell apart because nobody in his family could continue that artistic collaboration with Jane. So it was quite insightful because these workshops weren't just taking in work and producing work, but they had a sense of agency, they had a sense of collaboration. From the anecdotes that we had interviewing the son of Hamid Yassin, he would remember as a child Jane coming over to the family home with English and Dutch design books, and both of them would discuss colors and patterns. And so it was a very nice discovery for us, because otherwise, as you know, the batiks are signed under Jane's name, and so a collaborator like Hamid Yassin would have been very much anonymous otherwise. Yeah.
One final question. Anyone? Oh, yes.
Hi. My name is Lionel. I just want to ask, like, what are you mentioned like the unique combinations of flowers being one of Jane's hallmark signatures. What are some examples of like this unusual combination of flowers as compared to like usual combinations of flowers in other batik designs?
For Jane, it was this drawing of flowers from it was almost like a global referencing of international types of flowers. So in a batik, for example, you would have chrysanthemums juxtaposed alongside roses and irises and cattleya orchids, and these types of combinations are not really seen in batik makers, in any of her peers, or they're not also observed in batiks made by her mother, for example. So in her mother's era, it was quite common to see more generic formations of bouquets, even with tulips looking like lilies. I mean, those were kind of quite common at that time. And of course, her mother had a very vast range of design vocabulary where she added not just flowers but kind of very modern patterns such as stars. So that was her mother's kind of era. But in Jane's era, it seemed that she had this real love for a variety of flower combinations, and they weren't just flowers that would originate from Asia, for example, but she drew her inspiration from really the globe, the entire world.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi. That's absolutely terrific. I need to conclude by saying that the next talk is on April 10th. Dr. Mu from the State Islamic University of Mataram will talk about Indonesian batik in relationship to community development. There you have it right there, which is another interesting way of looking at batik, I think. And mostly we need to thank the Dalio Philanthropies for supporting this wonderful series of talks. But Naomi, terrific. Thank you very much for your contribution. You're supposed to scan this QR code and give your response. I forgot, I left out the last paragraph of my script. Scan the code, give us your feedback.